This is the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast, hosted by Justin Poulin. Tune in every month as we speak with industry experts to highlight success stories and solutions from the field that advance the healthcare supply chain. And now, Justin Poulin with this month's expert.
Welcome to this episode of the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Series. I'm Justin Poulin, and joining me now is Preston Hall, Director of Materials Management at the Pennsylvania Mountains Care Network. And Preston, we're going to be talking all about the Fellow program through AHRMM today, of which you are a fellow. So we'll get a little bit more into your story in the process, but I wanted to welcome you to the SME podcast here with AHRMM and maybe just have you introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about your background.
Yeah, my name is Preston Hall. I'm Director of Materials Management, and I actually started in construction, sweeping floors, driving truck, then ended up becoming a purchasing agent at that construction company. Then I moved because I got married and moved to a small community that had no construction companies of that size. So I ended up selling cars because you got to pay the bills. During that process, I ended up also doing all their purchasing for radio and print ads, moved from there to a juvenile detention facility and was supposed to be in the accounting department. But once again, somehow I ended up mutating into a buyer. And at that point, I decided maybe I needed to just concentrate on purchasing. And so I took a job at my local community hospital, being their buyer, and then worked my way up through the ranks from there.
What an interesting background, Preston. And, even that media sales, what a change that has gone through as an industry since that time. That's really cool. So you take the job and then you learn about AHRMM and begin to sort of pursue professional development to get some expertise in healthcare. How did that all evolve?
Yeah, when I was at my first hospital, they were a member of Quorum. And at that time, Quorum offered some a whole series of 5 educational classes. And fortunately, it was at more profitable time than it is now. And my CFO didn't hesitate to send me to those classes in Nashville and learned a lot about healthcare and ORs and lab and everything else, and truly invaluable training. And I don't think that most places are doing that anymore, which is a shame.
That's so true. And, Mike Schiller and I talked on the January AHRMM Updates podcast about the renewed focus of AHRMM to dial in on training and education. And so, it's interesting that you talk about that, different times, different budgets available for that kind of professional development. And yet at the same time, we're seeing a lot of turnover in this industry, a lot of new blood coming in, I would say, from outside of healthcare. And healthcare is so very unique. And I'm sure you learned that very quickly when, you started working with the local community hospital. But I want to add a piece here, which is you're so aligned on that training and education component of how we re-envision, I would say, supply chain, in the coming years, as it's obviously gone through a lot of rapid change recently. You're teaching the CMRP prep course at National AHRMM. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been doing that, co-teaching it since 2015. And also when they have their virtual instructor-led trainings for the last 5 or 6 years, Laura and I have been doing that as well. And actually, she and I both went to North Texas and Georgia AHRMM chapter meetings and presented it there over the years. So it's a passion. It's something I think we need to let people know what it takes to be certified. And the CMRP is the first step on that journey.
Yeah. Well, I know you're going to share some statistics with us because the CMRP is the first step. But, if you continue down that path, you're going to wind up where you are, Preston, which is an AHRMM Fellow. So how and when did you become a fellow? And maybe you could even talk a little bit about, your experience or maybe your motivations for becoming a fellow.
Well, I'll tell you, when I was at those classes, about halfway through, another fellow joined me. His name was Mickey Sparrow. He's from Toomey in South Carolina, which is now gone, and he's retired. But he came over to me and said, okay, I've got to ask. I started in healthcare a year behind you because he came out of the Air Force. And I'm a fellow and I'm on the fellow committee. And yet you're not. What's up? And I said, well, I sort of came up with a bunch of excuses as to why I never pulled it off. And, finally he said, well, I challenge you, either come up with a real excuse or get your stuff together and get it done. And I went, okay, I guess I really can't come up with an excuse. So I took just under a year and I was recognized at AHRMM 16.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a lot more about the process, right? And I like how, your story highlights sometimes we need to be challenged, not just encouraged, but challenged, to take that leap and what the benefits can be. We'll talk about here in a second too. But so as we kind of define the AHRMM Fellow program, what is it and how many fellows, are there out there right now?
Well, the fellow is the object of this program is to recognize the top of our profession. It's not necessarily like the CMRP. You could be a purchasing assistant or a buyer or in the storeroom and become a CMRP. But the purpose of the fellow is to say that, it's supposed to recognize the top of our profession. So that would be your directors, your VPs. It actually is looking for leadership. That's the kind of positions that it's looking for. When it comes to fellow, there's basically two classifications. There's the regular fellows that are within their. Now, I'll tell you, the fellow does renew kind of weird. Instead of being like every 3 years, like the CMRP, it renews every 3 to 5 years. It gives you that flexibility that, if you want to stretch it out and make it 5 years long, you can still be a fellow. But after you've renewed the third time, then you become a lifetime fellow. And so most people try to renew it on the 3-year cycle so they can get it done within 9 years instead of renewing it on the 5-year cycle and taking 15. So there's 25, currently there are 25 regular fellows and there are 26 lifetime fellows, and about half of those lifetime fellows are retired. So on paper, it looks like there's 51 in the country. There's probably closer to 40
that are active.
Yeah, that are active. And, I just think that really helps you to set yourself apart, that there's only 50 in the country.
Yeah. I almost feel like you should position it that way if you become a fellow to also highlight to leadership in your organization how unique, being a fellow is, and especially, amongst all of the various professionals that are out there in the industry. Put it in context for me. How many CMRPs are there versus, that number of maybe like 40-ish active fellows?
Sure. Well, there's about 3,260 AHRMM members, and there's about 2,000 CMRPs in the country at any one time. And according to the last membership survey, there's 683 of those 3,200 AHRMM members that have an MBA. But that's still a lot more than 51 fellows.
Yeah. So you're kind of talking about this a little bit, but maybe go a step further with how do you feel like becoming an AHRMM Fellow really sets you apart? Like obviously there's the numbers game where there are not that many. So it really sets you into a distinguished crowd. But what are some other things, maybe within the organization, maybe opportunities that are available to you by being an AHRMM Fellow? How does that really represent your commitment to the profession?
Well, I think a big part of the fellow is the name fellow. Now, it doesn't mean that much to a lot of people, but with those C-suite executives, they're working to become a fellow of ASHI. The doctors went to a fellowship to become an orthopedic fellow. And so, whereas in many worlds, that word fellow doesn't really constitute a whole lot, in most of the medical world, or at least the C-suite and physician world, that gets you recognition that I really obviously support the CMRP, but it certainly does not get you the recognition that saying to a doc, hey, I'm a fellow of AHRMM. That just gets a different level of respect from them that you would ever get by just saying, oh, I'm a CMRP or, in my case, I'm also a certified purchasing manager. And, whereas those were important to me, but I get recognition. Actually, probably the best recognition I got was the day I got back from that meeting in 2016. My boss walked into my office and said, I've got to run to a meeting, but I just wanted to tell you, I'm giving you a $5 an hour raise.
Wow.
And then he turned around and walked out. Now, I kept hoping that it wasn't the fellow, because then maybe he would walk in and do it again. But in all my years, he never did. And so I got to take the coincidence that he obviously understood what a fellow was. I didn't get any raise for the CMRP. And judging from the number of CMRPs that I talked to, the vast majority don't. But, I did get that raise, the day I walked back in.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, we have to address that part about the CMRP too. Like, I feel like that's something to definitely tackle. But to your point, I feel like you're using terminology that people that are not in supply chain can understand. And at a time when we're really having a unique opportunity to elevate the industry, to the C-suite and to a lot of the other decision-making partners, I would say, physicians being one throughout the organization, Fellow does have more of a broad sort of recognition, whereas CMRP, it's like, unless you're in supply chain, you may not know what that means or the significance or even what that process might look like. So I couldn't agree more with why it's valuable and how it can also be so easily recognized and bring credibility, and why that is important, I think, for all of us. So let's ask a couple of more questions, which is more informational for the audience. They may have heard about the fact that they could become an AHRMM Fellow, but, what are the requirements and what's the process?
Sure. First requirement is you have to be a member of AHRMM. Second requirement is you have to be a CMRP for 2 years before you can apply. You need to be a CMRP for 3 years before you get your fellow. But since that normally takes about a year, they let you apply after 2. Then there's certification points. You need to collect a total of 19, and they're not that hard. It's on continuing education, your experience, your professional activities. There's a form, you fill out what you've done, and it's pretty simple on that. The harder one is that you need to pick a topic and write an outline of the paper that you're going to do. The hardest part, and it's actually, I thought it was the hardest part, and it was what made it a detriment to me starting all those years, was that you have to pick a topic and you have to write a paper. And it needs to be peer reviewed by those people that are on the AHRMM Fellow Committee. We have had a couple people that have, gone full bore into the paper when they applied. And no, we're not recommending that. We're recommending that you pick your topic, write an outline, and that's all you need to submit. And at that point, we evaluate it and see whether that paper is, is it going to be enough on it, or is it too broad? Is it too specific, or is it too broad? And to fill out a quality paper. And so we might add or delete things. And if you've spent time pre-writing the whole thing, then you're going to be in trouble.
That's great to get some of those tips and tricks for being successful with it. We're just about out of time, but I kind of want to make sure everybody knows where they can get more info. I know it's available on the AHRMM website, but do you want to kind of point them in the right direction, Preston?
Yeah, actually, probably the easiest thing, because I was trying to come up with the actual right link, and I went to Google and I typed in AHRMM Fellow, and it took me right to the Fellow page on the AHRMM website. And, the application's there, the requirements are there. You can just work through those and see what there is. And when you do apply and your topic gets selected, you do get assigned a mentor who will help you work through that process and create your final paper.
That's great that there's support that's provided. I think that can be really critical, especially with, the kind of the demands on everybody's time these days. And you're right. If you type in AHRMM Fellow into your web browser, you'll be able to get probably the very first thing will pop up will be the link. It is also www.arm.org/about/leadership/fellow. So I'll kind of point everybody in that direction. But Preston, I really appreciate you sharing kind of the stories of your personal experience. I think it's also important to have some tips for it and know that there's going to be support. And so I'm going to challenge everybody who's listening to become a fellow, just like you were challenged. That has led you to be, one of the 40-ish active AHRMM fellows. And I think we can do our industry a great deal of service by continuing to seek those out and gain recognition and attention, especially from our C-level counterparts in our healthcare organizations. Because to your point about the CMRP, maybe that's the first step to getting more attention on the importance of those kinds of trainings when budgets are tight right now, Preston. So being an advocate for the rest of the people on your team as a fellow is also a great deal of benefit, from a leadership perspective. So thanks so much for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast. For additional resources, visit our website at ahrmm.org. That's AHRMM.org. Tune in next month for another edition of the AHRMM Subject Matter Expert Podcast.